crazy, right, Dave? The ride that goes along with Roth he loves Ed all through the beginning. He always loves Ed. He gets a little annoyed with him at one point, but you know what I'm saying? It was an interesting ride, I thought, the up and down with Dave.
It really was, because he was not enamored with Dave.
Not at all.
At all
Nope.
in the beginning.
Nope.
And like you said, he was in love with Ed.
Right.
I mean, he basically thought Ed was carrying the band.
Yeah.
And he was seriously thinking, like, what am I going to do with Dave? And he confirmed that he had, at one point, he was thinking, do I get Sammy in the band?
Right, exactly.
I mean, he was really thinking about that because he really had his doubts about Dave. But he does admit, thank goodness I did not act on any of that and kept Dave in the band.
Yep.
Because as you keep going chapter by chapter, he certainly does appreciate what Dave brought to the band in terms of, you know, being the front man, being a songwriter, being a strong lyricist, because he says elsewhere in the book, like a lot of people say who are familiar with both Dave and Sam was not the greatest lyricist in the world.
Right.
And Dave just, he brought something to that. So, yeah, I mean, it's quite the evolution, because by the time the band is breaking up in 1985, Ted can't even get himself to produce the band anymore because it's just not the same.
Right. We'll get to that. But I'm going to bring out this quote. This is an unbelievable quote. It'll knock you on your ass. So this is what it says. Direct quote from Ted. Now remember, the book is by Ted as told to Greg Renoff. Obviously, Greg's writing while Ted's talking. It's Ted's words and Greg's, writing it. So this is what he says here. Listen to this. I love Sammy as a person and as a singer, but if I tried to put him in Van Halen in 1977, I'd have made the biggest mistake in rock history, because Van Halen never would have made it without Dave fronting the band. That is one of the most powerful statements I've ever heard about Van Halen. What do you think?
There you go. That says it all.
Right?
He knew, even though Dave wasn't the world's greatest singer, he saw what Dave brought to the table.
Right.
And we've spoken about that before in terms of
course.
If it wasn't for Dave, the band would still be playing backyard parties in Pasadena.
Right.
I mean, he was the guy who had the drive to make the band be something.
He did. Now, what he was saying was, now you got to remember, Dave is a kid. He's not used to being in recording studios and performing for producers. So now this is what he said. He says, Dave croaked along. That was a quote from the book. And the other guys did amazing shit. But he said Dave had an engaging personality. He looked great on stage, but he really couldn't sing. He was weighing the two. Sammy, his lyrical ability really wasn't stellar. And then it wasn't until he got into Dave's dad's basement, which I believe is the house Dave lives in now, that he kind of really saw the band in their element. He really kind of opened his eyes to what Dave had, He said he had astounding intellect. He was clever and on point, and he even called him a genius and dead-on comic timing. He was impressed by his lyrics. He said all of this stuff overcame his vocal shortcomings, and he said he'd figure out a way to make Dave work in Van Halen so that it was acceptable, and he'd maximize his strengths and minimize his weaknesses. This is how good of a producer he was. He was going to make it all work because of what Ed's genius was. I mean, obviously, we all know about Ed's genius and his incredible abilities. He also said that the Van Halen equation was to be heavy and dark, but with pop sensibilities, and harmonies were their secret weapon. And he said that Mike and Ed vocal blending in the background sounded youthful, and he said he wanted to make a heavy album but have a pop sun-kissed Southern California vibe. And he said Roth had the smart-ass talk show host with great comic timing on top of that, and it all kind of added into the mix. So the dark, heavy guitar mixed with the kind of pop sensibilities, with the great harmonies, with Dave's wit and pizzazz on top of it. This is what made up Van Halen. Now, Ted was so entrenched in the band. This isn't some guy who's just thrown on there to make him sound good. Like, he was involved. He was in the tank with this band. Now, the other thing I want to note is he says here in multiple portions of the book how strong and sharp and good Michael Anthony is. And the reason why I think he does this is because of a lot of the recent comments that Ed has been making about Michael. This is what he says. Mike bass was an important part of Van Halen's sound. Forget the vocals. The root of the chord was always so solid with Mike. You never had to think about anything else when working with Van Halen. He knew almost intuitively how to stay a simple course when recording with Ed's guitar parts so they could shine. I didn't need to work all that much with Mike on the first album because I knew he was right on top of things. He had a lot of great things to say about Mike. His bass playing, his attitude, his background vocals, right, Dave? He really drove the point home about Mike.
He did. He definitely said his bass playing was an important part of the band's sound. I mean, totally gives full props for the background vocals as well. Interestingly, Ted reveals that he was also an uncredited background vocalist for some of the recordings, and that was part of the secret sauce.
Right.
And we didn't quite realize at the time, but that was what Ted was supposed to do. Like you said, these guys were really young when they came into the studio. I mean, they were like, I don't know if they were teenagers, but they were certainly like in their early 20s.
Yeah, maybe like, well, all right, let's say like early 20s. Like they were like, they were really young. Yeah.
I mean, they were not the Jackson 5.
No. Let's say like 77 is how many years ago? 43 years ago. That Eddie is 65 years old. So what is he? 22. He's 22. Yeah.
There you go. These guys are, definitely in their early 20s.
Right.
And Ted sees the raw talent that's there. And, his job as a producer is to bring that out and make them sound as good as they can be, which he absolutely did. Although the one thing he did not talk about really too much in the book that I was really curious about was why he panned Ed's guitar all the way to one channel for a lot of the early albums.
Yeah, that's a good question.
I mean, that was like there was literally a hard left of Ed's guitar. And I mean, I know Eddie used to joke like he wasn't crazy about it because at the time he had a car where one of the speakers was out and he couldn't hear himself because that was the speaker his guitar was playing.
That's true.
So I was always curious about that. But you can't deny that sonically, I mean, the album is really good, and he definitely captured the band's magic of them playing live.
That's for sure. And he talks about how hard they worked on achieving that sound on Van Halen 1. He really wanted to nail it. And I think a lot of it was what happened with Montrose. He really wanted to get this right. And he knew also the genius of Ed, and he knew he had to really nail it. So now, one thing he did talk about was he spent a lot of extra time with Dave, that the band was pretty tight. Mike and Al and Ed, like they would nail their parts, and he'd actually let them go. And he'd spend a lot of time in the studio with Dave, and they'd do multiple takes, and he would piecemeal best parts of each take to make the song. I thought that was very interesting in the book. He also said that Ain't Talking About Love he thinks is a perfect rock song. It's his favorite song that he ever produced by Van Halen, and went on to obviously praise Mike, saying, everyone who's a Van Halen fan needs to ask themselves, where would they have been without his voice? There's no one better when it comes to doing background parts. Again, more praise from Mike. He was talking about how Dave would write lyrics on the spot, and he'd come up with fantastic stuff. And even when something didn't work, he'd turn around and bring out something new. And he also talked about Eruption and how Don Landy, the engineer that he worked with, was rolling tape when Eddie was doing the warm-up on Eruption. And throughout the years, Eddie would always say, I could have done it better. Every time he talks about Eruption, even though Eruption is such a legendary track on Van Halen 1, but Eddie would always say to Don many, many years later, I could have done it better had you given me like a second take. But Ted Templeman pays credit to Don Landy for really capturing that moment, because it was Eddie kind of working it out in the studio. But the interesting part was you get a lot of inside from the record company executive perspective in this book, too. He says the record company wasn't really high on their music. He said no one was enthused about the band. Ted was 100% sold, and he said he thought their talent was limitless, but a lot of the people on the record company said it seemed too niche and it was too out of step with the times. Now remember, late 70s, high disco era, huge disco era. Rock was kind of falling out. Like I said, like Sabbath was ending, Led Zeppelin was ending, like all the big rock of the 70s was sort of coming to a close. But Ted Templeman was behind the scenes from a record executive standpoint, pushing this band and trying to get them budgets to get albums to DJs, and there's all kinds of inner workings behind the scene to get DJs to play songs and all kinds of stuff, get them on big tours like with Journey or with Black Sabbath, getting the promo dollars and money for the road. It's incredible. And one thing he does point out is that he pushed the band to make sure they keep their publishing. He told them not to split the money 4 ways, but they said, oh, we're a brotherhood, we're splitting the songwriting 4 ways. And then years later, it ended up becoming a point of resentment between Ed and Michael Anthony. He doesn't write. Somehow Alex skates it all. Not that Alex is writing in any of these songs, but he seems to get a freebie on there. And so if you look at the writing credits, it says David Lee Roth, Eddie Van Halen, and Alex Van Halen. Mike's cut out of the deal. Alex is not cut out of the deal because he's Ed's brother, but it's basically Ed and Dave writing the songs, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's no doubt in my mind about that. And like you said, Ted was really behind the scenes promoting the heck out of the band. That's how much he believed in them. He really wanted to make sure that they were being promoted as much as they could.
Right.
I mean, He really, really believed in the band.
Yeah, now you get to Van Halen 2, and he sort of talks about it like, they're kind of leftovers from Van Halen 1. Somebody get me a doctor was like iffy. Somebody get me a doctor is iffy? It was really weird. But he loved their version of You're No Good, which is he was so high on. And he said it was Dave's idea, and he kind of pushed for it, and he loves the screams that he got out of Dave on that. Now, he also claims he helped write the chorus, apparently. That's what Ted says. But he didn't take any money or credit for it. He says, one thing I wouldn't do when I did that was ask for writing credit or publishing. I didn't take any credit. But he did say that he wrote part of Dance the Night Away, which is sort of interesting. He thinks Dance the Night Away is Dave's best vocals of his career. He talks about Spanish Fly and how he was at a New Year's Eve party and he saw Ed pick up an acoustic instrument and play it. And he was so taken by that, we have to record that. You know what I mean? He also said that he loved Alex's drums on Everybody Wants Some. He basically said that he was channeling the song Stranded in the Jungle by the Cadets. Originally, they had a whole different intro with that Ed had a chorded intro that they scrapped and went more with the drums. He doesn't talk a lot about Alex in this book, which is kind of interesting. He praises Dave, he praises Ed, he praises Mike. He doesn't go praising Al. He says 2 things about Al that kind of stood out. Number 1, that his drums were incredible on Everybody Wants Some, and number 2, that he was the conduit to speak to Ed in the sense that he had a way that he would communicate with Ed. Kind of give the impression that Ed was sort of nervous around Ted a little bit, and they all were trying to please Ted. He was sort of like a father figure. I guess it was sort of like the first 4 or 5 albums that everybody was just like doing everything to please Ted. Whatever you want, Ted. No problem, Ted. Whatever you want, Ted. That kind of thing. He said that the vibe was always great in the band, and that he also noted in a simple rhyme as an overlooked classic. He compared it to The Who's Won't Get Fooled Again. Then he started getting into the whole situation when they got to Fair Warning, right? And now you're on the 4th album there. You could see that Ed was getting upset and sort of like agitated about what was going on with the band. But he said he cared about Ed deeply and said, if you want to walk out, I'll walk out with you type of thing. And I don't know, it was sort of really weird. I don't know, it was sort of an interesting moment. But he did note that he said Unchained, and this I thought really verified our argument, Dave, as Unchained being the best Van Halen song. He says, Unchained remind me of how prolific and special the songwriting partnership was between Dave and Ed. Ed came up with this incredible riff, and Dave paired it with those fantastic lyrics. None of them could match Van Halen's songcraft or humor when he talks about other bands. Like, everybody was trying to be Van Halen. Now, he talks